And today finds me in a little bit more urban setting than many of the other parks I have visited while producing videos for this channel. But there's a reason for this visit here to Paterson, New Jersey. I'm here with my guest commentator who's been on some of my other videos last year.
Yes.
Say hello, sir.
Hello.
And we are at the overlook on top of Garrett Mountain. This is part of the Garrett Mountain Reservation, which overlooks Paterson, New Jersey. This particular reservation is operated by the county here. I think this is Passaic County. But there's actually a national park in Paterson, New Jersey that has significant geological and anthropological significance. In other words, geological history and human history in this park, or in the national park that's in Paterson. And this is called, the park we're going to be visiting just down the mountain from here is called the Great Falls of the Passaic River. We'll talk more about that and look more at it in a few minutes. It's not very far from here, but I'm going to pause for a second. Let's take a look at the view from the top of Garrett Mountain. And the overlook at the north end of Garrett Mountain here, it's probably about 400 or 500 feet higher in elevation than the surrounding lowlands. And this is not a tall mountain by any means, but it has a great overlook of the more populated parts of New Jersey. These are the parts that became developed by Europeans first. Let's just soak up this view here, folks. And as we continue around this overlook, the most striking landmark in our view would be that of Manhattan in New York City, which is only 15 miles in direct mileage. In other words, if you were a crow. Let's zoom in on that. Little hazy. I can see it clearly through the haze. It may not come out so well in this video, but there is a mountain very similar to the one I'm standing on between Garrett Mountain, where we're standing today, and the taller buildings of New York City. It's called the New Jersey Palisades, and it's made of ancient lava flows that form cliffs on the west side of the Hudson River, from the George Washington Bridge all the way up to the Tappan Zee Bridge and points beyond. And this lava flow, which you can see in the foreground here, has a pinkish brownish color, and it also creates the rocks that have formed the Great Falls of the Passaic River. And the falling water from the Great Falls of the Passaic River was put to use by early industrialists and was kind of the prototype for a lot of other similar activities in the decades to follow. And as you're looking due north, this is downtown Paterson, New Jersey here. We've got Interstate 80 just below us here, which originates about 10 miles east of here and goes in all the way to the Golden Gate, or not the Golden Gate Bridge, but one of the bridges in the San Francisco Bay. So it goes across the entire United States. But to our north here, there's 4 buildings. They're identical apartment buildings. And between my location and those 4 buildings is a gorge in the lava and sandstone that forms the geology of this area. And that's where the waterfalls can be found, and the remains of the old factories. Some of the chimneys are still seen. These factories were used for generations, harnessing the power of the falling water of the Great Falls of the Passaic River. We'll continue on in just a few minutes. And we're back in a more shady location here to study the rocks that form the Great Falls of the Passaic River and the surrounding ridges of the Palisades and Garrett Mountain and several other mountains in this part of New Jersey and New York State. My guest commentator has a chunk of Garrett Mountain in his hands, Sir, can you tell us what this rock is made of?
It is made of lava.
Out of lava, or the more precise name for this type of lava is called basalt. And we're going to take a closer look at some basalt right here behind the parking area. It's a huge boulder. This is actually bedrock here. And you can't tell from looking at this, but this actually forms layers here. It doesn't have layers in the rock. Matter of fact, usually the cracks in these rocks are vertical, not horizontal, but the basalt forms horizontal layers in this part of New Jersey that have been tipped on angle, but not very steeply. And I'm going to use this half-eaten Bavarian cream donut to explain where the basalt comes from. So if we imagine this Bavarian cream donut as being the first part of the Earth's crust, not the entire Earth, but what we often find near the surface, you don't have to go down that far to get into what's called molten rock or liquid rock. And that's below all of us, whether we're in an ocean or on land. And that molten rock can be exposed from volcanic eruptions, but also from stretching of the Earth's crust. Let's take this donut and give a little tug. And continuing on, I've just done a little gentle pulling on the crust of this demonstration here. The crust of the Earth, which is on top of that Bavarian cream, I have pulled on both sides of it and created some cracks. And what can happen is the Bavarian cream, which would be the basalt, or sometimes it's called diabase, depending on how quickly it cooled, comes up through those cracks and forms these horizontal layers. And if you look at the frosting on top of this donut, pretend that's the Bavarian cream that came up through the cracks and spilled out onto the Earth's surface. So we've got the Earth's surface, then we've got some basalt layers on top, which is the white frosting, and the magma from which it came from is down below the surface that came up through these cracks. You can see the cracks in the Earth's crust and what would look like lava flows coming out as well. So that all happened as the Earth was stretching, and different rift valleys were forming in this part of the world, and some of them became wide enough to form lakes and swamps where the dinosaurs were roaming at that time. And there's fossils of dinosaur footprints in this area and in parts of Connecticut with similar geological history. So we'll continue studying this basalt down at the Great Falls of the Passaic River, just a couple miles from here. And we might even be able to view some of the rocks that are softer than the basalt that form the lowlands of this area and can and do have fossils in them. I don't know what will be available to study at that location. I did a hike up called Fowler and Pistapog Mountains in Connecticut a few years ago, and I found some basalt there, and actually had air bubbles in it that had not escaped before the basalt actually hardened to form that mountain. But that's a very similar geology as this mountain, and I did some demonstrations explaining how that rift valley formed on those videos. So those are available on this channel as well. We'll just do a quick scratch test. This basalt is not the hardest rock you're going to find in nature, but it's not the softest either. I can actually scratch it with that steel pocket knife. A lot of the quartzite sandstones around the Appalachian area are much harder than that, and you can't scratch them. They scratch your knife, the knife does not scratch them. So this is harder than the surrounding rocks, but not the hardest rock to be found in this part of the world. We're going to head down the mountain and go look at the falls. And we've come not even maybe 2 miles from the overlook on Garrett Mountain. And we've come down several hundred feet in elevation to the Passaic River as it flows through downtown Paterson, New Jersey. And the city was built around these falls and around the power of this falling water. And in the background here we have a small parking lot with a couple hundred spots and a small brick building there that is for interpretation by the National Park Service rangers. And there are steps that lead up to the overlooks of the falls themselves. My guest commentator today cannot go up steps, so we've taken a different way, and we had to park on a city street to gain access to the tops of the falls here without steps. So that can be done as well. There is parking on the city streets of Paterson, New Jersey. Sir, we're looking at the cliffs here across the river. And they got a real tall wrought iron fence here to keep people safe. Sir, what are those cliffs made of? What kind of rock?
Lava.
Lava. And the lava, when it cools and forms layers, is called basalt or diabase. In this case, it's called basalt. And it often forms vertical cracks as it cools. Even though the layer is deposited horizontally, as it flows out of the cracks in the Earth's surface, the cracks in the cooled rock actually form vertically. That's obvious here. It's obvious on the New Jersey Palisades along the Hudson River. Let's go take a look at the top of the falls, the Great Falls of the Passaic River. And the Passaic River flows out of north central New Jersey towards the area around Staten Island, lower New York Harbor, where it meets salt water. And before the actual Great Falls of the Passaic, we're on top of that layer of lava that's about 100 feet thick here. And there's a small dam here about 4 feet high that was constructed with the purpose of putting the falling water to work. So instead of going over the waterfall and looking real pretty, which is great, they also wanted to harness that power in a controlled fashion. And they created a little canal here to divert the water and put it to work to go through. What's it going through right now as we speak? Guest commentator, what's it going through?
The power plant.
It's going through a power plant. Hold on one second, we'll take a look at that. And just below the diversion canal, above that dam, above the main attraction, the Great Falls of the Passaic River, that water is diverted through this, what looks like a brick building, which is a power plant that runs a turbine to generate electricity. And the Park Service has interpretive materials available here to help you understand more about how else this falling water was harnessed and where the remains of the factories were that were being used when water power was their main source of energy. And just below what I'm going to call a saddle dam that diverts water through that power plant. Fortunately, they do let quite a bit of water over the falls for our enjoyment. And just as the river comes around that bend, it makes a hard right turn, or comes over the falls and makes a very hard abrupt right turn into a slot in the lava or basalt layer that we've been studying all day. And that slot is obvious here. There's actually a steel arch bridge right over top of it that we can walk across and get a view of the waterfall in its entirety. So that video will be coming in just a few minutes here, but this is interesting geology here. As I mentioned, the cracks tend to form vertically in the basalt layers. And because of that, this Passaic River has found a large crack that it's actually that's helped create this slot that the waterfall falls into. So you don't look at, when you're standing at the bottom of the falls, you're right at the base of a cliff. And the view of the falls is actually from either side, either to its left or right. In this case, if we're on river left, if you're going down river, this would be the left side of the falls as we look. There's another famous waterfall in the world that has similar geology. It's formed in a rift valley with lava flows similar to this in another continent of Africa. And that waterfall has a name that might ring familiar with you. My guest commentator is going to tell us the name of the waterfall in Africa that has similar geology to the Great Falls of the Passaic River. Sir, what's the name of that waterfall?
Victoria Waterfall.
Yes, Victoria Falls. And I believe that's either in Zimbabwe or one of the surrounding countries. I'd have to get the World Atlas out. But it is similar in the fact that it's formed in a slot in a basalt layer. We're going to continue around the pathways and bridges of this park and get some more vantage points of the Great Falls of the Passaic River. And let's take a better look at the waterfall as it drops into this slot in the basalt bedrock here at the Great Falls of the Passaic. Much of the east side of this park is either very fine crushed stone or pavement, but there are some steps if you want to get the closest vantages to the falls. But much of it can be seen by people with physical handicaps, but not all of it.
I'll wait at the top.
Hi guys. And here you can see the full size of the waterfall of the Great Falls of the Passaic. And according to the park literature, this is 70 feet of waterfall right here. And again, it's in this narrow slot. So it's difficult to see all of it from one vantage point. And we've come just a few feet to the left of that last vantage point, and there's a small flume that's found yet another crack in this basalt. So when you think basalt bedrock, think lots of vertical cracks, which makes for a real interesting waterfall because it's going to find lots of ways down the cliff. As you can see here, it's always finding new ways down. And the main flow is to my right, and because this is such a narrow slot, you can't even see the bottom of it from this vantage. But we're going to go out on the steel arch bridge over here, and from there you can see the whole waterfall in its entirety. And here you can actually see where most of the water is going over the Great Falls here, but you can't see where it's coming out at the bottom. It's well out of view here, but we've got more slots in this basalt where the water could have gone in the past and probably still does go at higher water levels. So a real interesting place to learn geology. If you're interested in igneous rocks and the geological history of New Jersey, Connecticut, and parts of New York, this is a great park to see it up close and personal. And let's take one final look at the Great Falls of the Passaic River here in Paterson, New Jersey. Spent 3 or 4 hours here looking around and exploring the cliffs up on Garrett Mountain, which is just to my southwest. There's a radio tower up there. That's where the type of rock that forms these falls and the mountains in this area. And it may not show up too well, but there's a family of birds kind of hanging out in the shadow of this other bridge. And I'm seeing a lot of birds swooping and swooning around the gorge formed by the Great Falls of the Passaic River here. My guest commentator is going to mention what kind of birds they are.
They're called pigeons.
Pigeons. People think pigeons, they think living in the city and eating our food, and they do that. But the reason they're attracted to living in cities and towns with large stone and brick buildings is they naturally dwell on rock faces, just like the one we're seeing here. And boy, you know, this view up the slot that forms the falls of the Great Falls of the Passaic River from this footbridge is the best view by far. We'll zoom in a little. We can see all three sets of falls that we looked at earlier. Got one to the left and one in the middle, and then the main flume is to the right. We'll even zoom in a little further. You can see how narrow that slot is, folks. So there's no way you could stand under the falls to cool off or even access them with all these rocks and boulders. You would not be allowed to access by boat from the bottom, but even if you could, it would be very difficult because of these rough and dangerous currents and rocks. So best to be viewed from these vantage points that have been constructed in the park. So this is the Great Falls of the Passaic River at higher water levels. There would probably be more flumes to be seen, and at really high water levels this could be really interesting because it could be just one big wash of water. That would be something to see. In the meantime, we're going to sign off. I've got several more waterfall adventures planned in the late summer and early fall of 2021, so stay tuned for those.